Just to say a few words about Open Book Publishers, for those of you who haven't heard of us. OBP is a leading independent open access book publisher. It's not for profit and it's run by academics based in Cambridge. We've been going for about 12 years now. All of our books are published open access without any embargo. We publish around 25 to 30 books a year, although we're looking to increase that number slightly, I think, in the next couple of years. And we don't charge authors to publish with us. So you may have heard of the book processing charge, or perhaps its cousin in the journal world, the article processing charge. So obviously this, in case you don't know, is a fee that authors or their funders are asked to pay upfront to publish something open access, but we don't charge those fees. And I can talk a bit about why that is. So I'm just going to say a few words. It kind of breaks down into 4 chunks, really. So I'm going to talk a bit about why open access, why we think it's important, about what open access looks like at OBP, sort of just to give you an idea of the practicalities of what the books look like, what our peer review processes are, and things like that. Just to touch briefly on how it is that we don't charge the book processing charges, and then to have just a sort of few words about the future of open access in the kind of short to medium term, covering a couple of things like the UKRI open access policy and a couple of organisations that OBP is involved with, which Suzanne mentioned when she introduced me, so Scholar-led and COPIM, and hopefully I'll have time just to talk briefly about those. So this is kind of the traditional model of publishing. The average monograph sells around sort of 200 to 400 copies in its lifetime. They are priced typically at between £80 to £120, and there is something of a connection, I think, between those 2 facts. They're mostly bought by university libraries, and obviously, you know, some individuals will also buy a copy, but that's the kind of numbers, sales figures that you're looking at for the average monograph. So the great advantage for open access, as we see it, is that it creates more readers, basically, for academic work. So the figures for our books, they're accessed freely over 20,000 times each month. And I should say that's only for the figures that we can measure. Obviously, since the book's open access, it can be freely shared. So there are some platforms that send us statistics for how much our books are viewed and downloaded, but they will be available in places where they're not tracked. Obviously, if it's open access, it's not going to go out of print because all of our books are print on demand. So you don't have a print run which then runs out. And of course, they're available online on a number of different platforms. We're also working as part of COPIM to think about archiving digital works and how that can be improved. And so obviously open access, the book is available everywhere with an internet connection, which is more equitable than the kind of having the clusters of university libraries where the books tend to be housed. And if you have access to a university library that has the book, then that's great. But if you don't, then you may struggle. So this is obviously the great thing about open access, that the book is available online. And so it's easier for many different groups of people to access. So partly that might be other academics. Obviously, not every university library houses every academic book. But there are also other groups that it might be interesting to think about who can access a book more easily when it's OA. That includes independent scholars, policymakers, interested members of the public, and also the subjects of your research. So obviously this depends on what your area of study is. But for some subjects, for example, anthropology, we have a series that we publish, the World Oral Literature series. And it was particularly important to the editors of that series that the books were available open access, because they wanted the communities who are written about and studied in the books to be able to access the work without any kind of barrier. So more so broadly speaking, basically what I'm saying is more readers means more impact for the work, means the work is more able to do work itself in the world. People can adapt it, they can use it, they can build on it, they can the work is kind of much more out there, I suppose. And some people think that if a book is open access, it is only available digitally, but I've already mentioned that our books are produced print on demand, so we publish paperbacks and hardbacks. And actually, just to say, that's probably true of most open access book presses that I'm aware of. Most of them print physical books as well as digital. So Our paperbacks and hardbacks are priced around £15 for paperback and around £30 for hardback. So that's obviously cheaper than the prices I was just talking about, and that's deliberate. That's again kind of an access issue for us. We want to try and keep the prices as low as we can. We do charge for them because, as I'll explain, the sales are an important revenue stream for us and help us to continue our work, but we try to keep those prices as low as we can. We also charge for the EPUB and the Mobi editions. They're priced at £5.99. I'm pretty sure it's across the board. And then, of course, you've got the free digital editions, so PDF to read online or to download, HTML and XML editions of our books. So this is what a book looks like on our website. You can see there you've got the various different editions and formats. And then you've got the read the PDF and read the HTML buttons. So if you clicked on those, this is the PDF reader online. You can see it's kind of formatted like a print book, and you can click on it and the page will kind of turn. I think we've just updated our PDF reader, so books that we publish now aren't going to be in this kind of facing page format, but most of our books that are currently published are available like this. And then this is the HTML edition, so you can see it's all the same content, same images, everything the same, except for the formatting is different when it's HTML. Some people find this cleaner to read. I find it easier to read books online in HTML rather than PDF, but both are available. And the PDF, obviously, you can also download, so that's helpful. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about innovation later on, but just to sort of touch on some of the innovative work that we do. At OBP, we're interested in thinking about what a book can look like and be and do when it isn't limited to just the printed format. So some of the things that we've done with some of our books, and I've got a couple of examples that I'll talk about briefly, but we've got embedded audio and video. So if there's audio or video material which is relevant to the book's argument, you can actually click and listen to or watch that as you're reading. Some of our books have commentary and text analysis functions embedded in them. We've developed a zooming function for books where the images are particularly critical to the argument. And we've done some projects which are thinking about bringing digital platforms into a kind of printed form. So a good example of that is we recently published a lexicon of medieval Nordic law, which is drawn from a database. And so it's a kind of printed, published representation of the content of that database at a particular moment in time. Obviously, the database will continue to develop, but the book is a record of what it looked like at the time of publication. And it's also, I think, sometimes easier to have that output then assessed, maybe for promotion purposes or for the ref, if it's available in a kind of book format. And this is just a couple of examples. So the top one here, Enunciations. This was a project which was, it brought together composers of choral music and theologians who were interested in the theme of the Annunciation. And as part of that project, I think it was 7 new choral pieces were composed and performed. So the recordings of those performances are embedded in the book. And so as you're reading about the composer's reflections and the process of composition, you can listen to the choral music that they created. And then the bottom example here, Dickens's working notes for Dombey and Son. Obviously, Charles Dickens is a novelist. You may or may not know he published his work serially in installments rather than all together in one novel, at least initially. And so we have the notes that he took throughout that process. And this book examines those notes for what they can tell us about Dickens's creative strategies. And as part of that, we have images of every page of the notes. And so we developed a zooming function. Obviously, you can see there some of the handwriting is very small and cramped. And so this zooming function just allows you to focus on a particular part of the page and to examine it more closely. So I mentioned that readership is sort of the key thing for us with open access. And this, as a result, we try to find ways to visualize that for each book so that people can see the kinds of engagement that the book is receiving. So each homepage of each book has this line to see how the book's been read around the world. Click here. And then we provide statistics, and we also give this map as a kind of visual representation of some of the engagements that the book's received. As I mentioned, we can't track every single engagement or download, but for what we can track, this is where we keep the information. And so you can see there, the book's been read online on Google Books and on our website, and it's been downloaded from OAPEN, which, if you're not aware of OAPEN, it's an online platform which houses thousands of open access books. And then on our website and on Open Edition, the book's been downloaded from. And the map is quite helpful. We don't have geographical data for all of these interactions, but it's often useful and interesting for authors to be able to see how much the book has been read around the world. Obviously, another of the advantages, as I mentioned, of open access is the ease of access from anywhere with an internet connection. And so, for example, this book is about the development of information technologies in Russia. And so for these authors, it was particularly interesting to know that as you look at that map, the darker the colour, the more it's been read in that region. And so Russia is the third highest on the list of places where this book's been read after the US and the UK. So that was particularly interesting for these authors to have that information. So I'm just going to briefly touch on the sort of publication process at OBP. I mentioned that we don't charge the book processing charges, so we ask authors to apply for grants if they can, but that's not a condition of publication. So if you don't have a grant but your book passes peer review, then we'll publish it. And conversely, if you do have a grant but your book doesn't pass peer review, then unfortunately we won't be able to publish it. And I'll talk briefly at the next slide about the funding model that enables that to happen. So we aim for a speedy turnaround time, obviously without compromising on quality, but we try to have the peer review process completed within 3 months, which obviously depends to an extent on the peer reviewers, but that's our kind of target. And then obviously if the book is accepted, the author will go away, they will make changes based on the peer review, and after they submit the final manuscript to us, we aim to publish within 3 months after that point. And some of the things that authors say they like about us, we try to be very author-focused. I mentioned that we're academic-led press, so several of us have experience of publishing academic work ourselves, and so we understand the process a bit from the author's point of view as well. And some of the innovative publication techniques I was talking about earlier on, a lot of those kind of grow out of conversations with authors about what is the best way to present this work and how might we think about doing it differently in interesting ways. And as we're a scholar-led press, the rigor of the peer review and the editing process is important to us. So this is just to touch briefly on the revenue model. So as I mentioned, we don't charge the book processing charges, and sales are an important income stream for us. So I mentioned that we charge for paperback, hardback, and some of the digital editions. And that makes up 44% of our revenue. I should mention this is for the year 2018-2019, which is the last complete financial year. And so that's just worth pausing very briefly, I think, to note that, there's sometimes an assumption, I think, that there are no sales when a book is made open access, and that's actually not the case, certainly for us. Grants and donations is the grey chunk, so that's if individual authors are able to acquire grants to defray the costs, that's that chunk. And we also sometimes get grant funding as a press and attached to any particular book. Title production charges are things like if an author hasn't done the index and wants us to do it, then we'll charge for that. And then the library membership program. So this is something that we developed in 2015, and it's being picked up more by more open access presses now. Sussex, I believe, is one of our library members, and the model is basically that a library pays £300 a year to us. In return for that, there's discounts on the printed copies. All of the digital editions are freely available, and that's not just to the library, that's to anyone on the library network. And then we also send metadata to the library and various other things, but I think the main motivation a lot of our library members tell us is just that they want to support the work that we do. They want to support open access for books. So that's how we don't charge our book processing, any book processing charges. And finally, just to talk briefly about the future for open access books and what it might look like. The UKRI, I don't know if everyone's aware of the UKRI policy proposal, but earlier this year, UKRI said we want all of the work that we fund to be published open access, and this is our proposal for what that policy might look like. And the proposal included the date of the 1st of January 2024, and the idea is that any books contracted to be published after this date should be open access. So that policy proposal review was concluded, I think, in May of this year, and The intention, I believe, was to publish the policy by the end of this year, but I think that's now been delayed, so it's going to be next year as a result of the pandemic and everything that has been going on. But the intention is that that policy will feed into the next cycle of the REF as well. At least that was what was being said in May. And then Plan S, I don't know if people know of Plan S in the journal world, but basically it's a similar thing in a way. So Coalition S is a group of European funders who've come together and said they want the work that they fund to be published open access. At the moment, Plan S is focusing on journals, but there is growing conversations about the idea of a Plan S for books and what that might look like. So that's kind of coming further down the horizon. And finally, I just want to talk briefly about Scholar-Led and COPIM, which are two organisations that OBP is working with. So Scholar-Led, you might have been listening to what I've been saying about OBP and what we do and thinking, well, okay, that's great, but you're just one press. So what about, are there other presses that are doing what you're doing? So we teamed up with Mastering Press, Mise en Press, Punctum Books and Open Humanities Press to form a consortium called Scholar-Led. So the five of us have different editorial approaches, different ways of working, but we all share, we're all not-for-profit, we're all academic-led, and we all share the goal that none of us will rely on book processing charges to fund our work. And so as part of that, we've been developing collaborative approaches to open access book publishing and thinking of each other not as competitors, but as colleagues and as collaborators. And the sort of key thing that's come out of our work so far is that we are all key partners in the COPIM project. So Suzanne mentioned this at the beginning, community-led open publication infrastructures for monographs. And COPIM is a project which is going to run for 3 years. We've just completed our first year. And it's funded by Arcadia and by Research England. 3.5 million pounds of funding has gone into it. And as you can see there, those logos are all different organisations who are involved with COPIM. And it sort of shares the kind of collaborative ethos of Scholar-Led. There are universities involved, there are university libraries, there are publishers, there are infrastructure providers. And we're all interested in creating open systems and infrastructures which are not owned by any particular company, they're not profit-making, that they're community governed, and that the aim is that they will develop and strengthen open access book publishing in different ways. So we have different working packages that are looking at consortial funding models. We have a business model work package, which in Open Access Week announced that we're working with a press to flip their output to open access. The model's called Opening the Futures, if you want to look that up. And we're looking at metadata and discoverability, we're looking at archiving, we're looking at experimental publishing. So if you're interested in open access book publishing and how it might be developing in the next few years, I think COPIM is really worth checking out. And the last thing I wanted to plug was this. So this is the Open Access Books Toolkit. This is something which OAPEN, who I mentioned earlier, are hosting on their website, and they led the creation of it. It's something that I contributed to. And the aim is basically to provide information to authors who are interested in publishing open access. It's not endorsing any particular publisher or any particular model. It's just designed to try and give an overview of the landscape of open access books for the author, excuse me, and with the author's perspective in mind. So I think that's worth checking out if you're interested. So that's everything. I hope I haven't spoken for too long. Thank you all for listening, and I'm looking forward to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I should say that I'm Alex Butterworth, and I'm stepping in at Suzanne's request to sort of chair questions. We're going to actually take a second speaker and then have a short 1 or 2 questions in response to those before moving on to the last two and a longer discussion and questions. So could I, thank you, Lucy, and could I just ask, is it Tanya next, I think? Or Ariana? Who's...
Ariana next, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Ariana. Okay, yes.
Okay, so it's me.
Just to introduce Ariana Chula. Thank you.
I'm trying to share my screen. Can you see it? Can you see this? 1 second, loading. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, great. Okay, so thanks very much for having invited me to this seminar, and thanks for everybody who made it. So my name, as Susanna and Alex said, is Arianna Chula. I am Deputy Director at King's Digital Lab, where my main role is actually being an analyst. So for those of you who don't know what King's Digital Lab is a research software engineering lab embedded within the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at King's College London, where we work at the same time on around maybe 60 projects. So it's what somebody has called digital humanities at scale. So I'll try to talk a little bit about our own way of embedding the development of research publication within our software development lifecycle without giving maybe too detailed examples, but hopefully giving a flavor and an idea of how we work. First of all, a small premise maybe about the open ethos of the humanities that others have reflected on. I'm sure you're all aware that in the humanities there is a long tradition of developing, organizing knowledge and creating structured information in the form of what information studies scholars have defined as access resources. So think, for example, dictionaries, bibliographies, glossaries, and so on. So there is a long tradition in the humanities of doing that, and there are still very long shelf, if you like, projects. Think, for example, of all the European Academies multi-volumes project that run for years and years that develop these access resources. And even in the digital realm, Smithies, for example, suggested that the humanities infrastructure, to a certain extent, compared to the sciences or the STEM fields, could be considered open by default, because the tendency is indeed to develop collections, digital collections that are open for others to access. But obviously what open means can be quite complex. So open access is a kind of interlocked chain of factors and dimensions that go from, for example, the adoption of open standards to the availability of open data and policies around those, the access, open source code, and so on. So it depends really what we talk about when we talk about open access and how we want to define it to really understand which is the context we're playing within. And we could argue that maybe in the humanities, the engagement with open access is mainly at the level of scholarly dissemination. And I think that the institutions like ours and those involved, for example, presenting at the seminar, have in a way that role within the digital humanities community to engage with open approaches to technologies that goes also beyond the scholarly dissemination itself. And so assess openness in terms of technical affordability, if you like. So what kind of things you can develop that make open access publication, and what does that mean, that open access, and at what level can we make it happen? And also that concept of facilitating and enabling that concept of performativity that Gray talks about when he talks about data walls. So the idea that data are not just about representing or describing something, but they could also make us see things differently, also in the humanities, with that kind of social aim in mind, but also in connection, for example, with the past and our cultural heritage. So kind of foregrounding the subjectivity of data, the pragmatics and so on. And in general, the way we build data infrastructure is all relevant, I think, for the kind of open access and open publications that we want to foster in the humanities. So having said that, how do we relate how digital humanities relate to the humanities from the point of view of data, and what do we do to create these open publications? Well, if I think of the work we do at King's Digital Lab, the way we engage with open publications is by analyzing, interpreting, and manipulating and creating data. And it's by doing this that we remake, in a way, the object of study for the humanities. And we have a responsibility in that sense, that we're really remediating, rethinking, restudying those objects. And the process via which, in my opinion, we do this mainly is modeling, intended in a very wide sense. So from processes of digitization to translation into processable media products, conversion into machine processable formats, machine learning, operationalizations of different kinds. So I'll talk a little bit about how then we engage with these modeling processes within King's Digital Lab, and how the development of open publications happens within the lab. And to do so, I need to, even if very briefly, introduce our software development lifecycle. You'll find more information about this on our site. I added a link there if people are interested, and you could access also our project templates. And I think it's important here to say that being open also means this, so sharing the approaches to how one works, and also be open to critique, because by no means we are perfect in the way we do things, and this is just one model, and it's our model, and it's full of gaps and things that could be improved. But openness also means, of course, embracing, if you like, an open stack in technological terms, which is again what we try to do at the lab. Adoption of open standards and so on. So there are different ways in which you could define this open process. But okay, so if we look a little bit more about how we develop projects, obviously whether we are developing publications that are open depends on the requirements of the specific project we're engaged with. So typically what happens is that some partners contact us, or sometimes it might be part of a conversation that's spurred at a conference or an event. And then the whole team weekly assess project ideas that come our way. So it might be, as I said, via meeting somebody, might be via emails, might be using our forms on the site and so on. And we assess these project ideas every week, following, well, every week so far, but we're moving into a bit of a longer cycle to make sure that our comparison is a bit fairer. And we assess these project ideas based on a kind of multi-dimensional set of criteria, from financial criteria, workload, interest, availability, so different things. And if we think that a project idea is something that we like and we can pursue, then we take it to a further step, which is the requirement assessment phase. I should have said that our software development lifecycle is mapped to the Agile DSDM model, for those of you that know about that development approach to management in development processes. So this requirement assessment phase typically involves an analyst like me meeting with the partners, discussing a bit more the high-level requirements for the project. And this is where basically the definition of the products for that project take shape, even if at a very high level, as I said. So whether the product for a project might be an open access publication or not is defined within this set of requirements. So it could be, for example, that the product for a project could be a data set as opposite to a fully fledged web publication, for example, or a set of software modules, or different things, or a set of visualizations, or all of these things together. So once that requirement assessment takes place, typically the analyst develops together with the partners and in consultation with other members of the team a feasibility document where we outline these requirements and we prioritize them. But we also include things like a sketch of the solution architecture for the project, an assessment of risks and issues or other technical considerations, and also, more importantly, the research context for that project and the research questions and objectives, and how the technical approach fits or is suited for that kind of context. Typically, partners come to us when they don't really have funding. So at the end, if at the end of the feasibility process, we think that that project is feasible, is viable, then we produce a product quote, which obviously include the amount of the cost that that project would have for us, so that the partners can include our cost in their funding application. But I should add that that feasibility and that product quote is more than just, if you like, a price list, but it includes, as I said before, all sorts of other types of feasibility consideration, from indeed solution architecture, use of standards, research context information, and the technical considerations related to that, and also forward planning for the sustainability of the project, for example. Our involvement then in the funding application varies a lot, depends, for example, if some of us are co-investigators or not in the project, but maybe that's not so important. But anyway, once the project then goes through the application phase, and in those lucky cases, which is about 25% usually of the applications we're involved in is successful, then the project gets basically starts, and that's where the kickoff happens. And this is where the kind of sub team within KDL that will work in the project is usually defined. even if obviously all the members of the team already engaged in that pre-project phase, in the analysis, in the design, in the review of feasibility and so on. This is the moment where that team gets a little bit more defined. At the kickoff meeting, we review those high-level requirements, and very importantly, we define the first increment for the project, so the first thing that we like to work on. And that's when the evolutionary development starts. So projects can be very long, very short, very experimental, much more traditional, but in any case, the evolutionary development is iterative and incremental. So it could be just a few increments, or it could be 5 years of increments and different releases. During the evolutionary development, there are also project review phases, project reviews that take place typically once a month, sometimes more often, sometimes less often. And usually all the increments end up in a deployment phase, which could be internal. So for example, if let's talk about an open access publication, there is a release of a component of that publication that the partners have to assess internally in a staging site, for example. Or it might be that, that these increments also end up into a public-facing resource, that it's gradually augmented with new functionalities. In any case, at the end of the process, there's usually a release phase. I say usually because indeed our, also the range of products that we produce at the lab has changed a lot in the last, well, since the lab has been, is in place, and also in relation to the history, if you like, of digital humanities at King's, from, for example, historical databases, prosopographical resources, to, as I was saying before, the development of data sets or software modules or machine learning libraries and so on. So there is a shift, and there is a variety of things that we might release at the end of that process. But typically, if we end up hosting and maintaining a web resource that we develop, the release moment is also the time where we ask the partner to sign a service level agreement with us. And when the project is funded, for example, via a UK Research Council, this is typically a 5 years SLA that will include hosting and maintenance for that project in the post-project phase or in the post-funding phase. And that's also when the project, in a way, has its life after the funding period, where, for example, we can assess things like analytics, like Lucy was showing, the impact and so on, but also plan for, in some cases, sunsetting or gradual degradation, if you like, of some of the functionality of the project. And so I was interested, I'd like to hear more from Lucy about that, that term she used before of never out of print, because this phase is very important for us. And obviously it's very important for the research outputs that we create. Yes, so the research data management obviously approaches behind all this, and also an eye to sustainability of the research products. But as I said, you can find, if you're interested in more information on our sites also about the project templates. The example that I wanted to focus on talking about open publication is a call that we issued, I think it was in 2018, I should look back, but there is a link there with Stanford University Press Digital, where the aim was to, two things, I guess, was to join forces to create publications or innovate in the publication landscape within an academic context, so produce high quality publication that were also innovative, and at the same time also align the publishers and our visions in terms of archiving and sustainability strategies. And one of the projects that we engage with is this project led by Kath Bode at Australian National University, Reading at the Interface, Literature, Cultures and Technologies. It was a project, some aspect of this project were already funded and ongoing, and what we worked with Kath on and SUP was to develop, if you like, a proposal for a hybrid publication. And so submit to SUP a digital prospectus that included both the kind of normal digital prospectus content, for example, the project statement, the background context for that project, as well as our technical feasibility process. So we merged the two. And as you can see from the table of content, this is a document that it's over 70 pages, where we work together in trying to integrate these two things. So as I mentioned what the opportunities were behind this, so the idea of encourage or develop innovative publications with high quality and innovation, and also to align in terms of archiving and sustainability strategies. But I guess I should also highlight that the main challenges were the fact that in this case, we didn't really have any funding to do this work. So this was all pre-grant analysis from our side, which was definitely a learning process and engaging, but indeed raises some challenges. And also the fact that we had to align three different, if you like, approaches and schedules. So on one end, obviously our own, so the research software engineering team development life cycle, even if in this case we didn't really do any concrete development, but we engaged in this analysis work. Then obviously the partner, the research partner own schedule in terms of the research to engage with this work. And then obviously the publisher schedules of production. So now the partners have a contract for a hybrid publication. So this work was successful in that sense, but the hybrid publication isn't out yet. So it's a really long process if you compare, for example, to the 3 months that we heard about before. So I think that forum like this could bring about better mechanism of collaborations between, for example, research software engineering teams like ours and publishers, because there are a lot of opportunities, but still maybe not enough models or mechanisms to work together efficiently. So also very glad to hear about some of the initiatives that Lucy mentioned. My last slide is about REF. So again, Lucy touched on this, and I want to say that obviously, even if some of our works are very experimental and they might not end up becoming traditional digital outputs, digital research outputs as such, obviously we do also develop a lot of websites that actually are submitted to the REF as digital outputs in their own right. And because of this, we decided 2 years ago, I think, we decided to develop a checklist of criteria that we thought could augment the assessment of digital outputs, in addition, obviously, to the criteria within specific disciplines. So, for example, if you're an historian, like Tim, and you submit your digital output to the REF, obviously, as an historian, you'll have, and as a reviewer in the REF panel, you'll have a set of criteria via which you assess the high quality of that product. But what about the criteria with respect to a research software engineering perspective? So we try to propose a holistic assessment that obviously takes stock of all the work that others did before us, and listed this year to give an idea. So they range from credits, very important, to licenses, ownership, copyright, but also edition version, for example. Lucy mentioned before the idea of a snapshot. We do that for all our submitted REF outputs that are hosted and maintained by KDL. So we provide a clone to the REF panel so that they could use that photograph of that publication, even if the database or the resource behind it is in continuous evolution. User experience, accessibility, very important, and so on. So again, sustainability, obviously, welcome to look at it. And if you have any questions or you'd like to discuss, I'd be happy to. What else? Yes, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ariana. Now the suggestion is that we take one or two questions, if there are any at this point. I think I was asking for some in the chat, but don't see any yet. Does anyone, would anyone like to kind of either put one there or raise a hand at this point? No?
We had a hand up then.
Oh, I'm sorry, is there one?
Yeah, we had.
Oh, sorry, Amy.
Yeah.
Hi.
That's all right. I was just trying to look and see how I could put my hand up digitally and failed. It was just a question for Lucy actually about she talked a little bit about the peer review process taking 3 months-ish, and then 3 months through to publication. I just wondered if you could explore that timeline a little bit more and sort of, yeah, talk a little bit about what happens during those processes.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the peer review, we asked reviewers to attempt to return, if they're reviewing the entire book, to return it within 3 months. Sometimes with edited collections, we might get each chapter peer reviewed separately, and theoretically that should be faster, but actually the management of that process sometimes takes longer than for a single reviewer reviewing a single manuscript. But then in terms of the production schedule, so once we've received the reports and if they're favourable, the author's made their adjustments and we get the final manuscript, I think we spend about 4 weeks on the editing process, and then the manuscript is returned to the author, and then they respond to the edit. Sometimes this can involve some back and forth, and sometimes it's relatively straightforward. And then the book goes to typesetting, and we aim to get the initial typesetting stage completed within, I think it's 2 weeks, or I could be wrong about that, but I think it's 2 weeks. And then the author reviews the typeset proofs, and then again, you know, if they take a while, it takes longer, but if they're quick, we can move straight on to the next phase, which is then the publication phase. So distribution and yeah, setting it all up on the website and all those kinds of things.
Tim.
Thanks, Lucy. I'm afraid this question to you as well. I mean, traditionally, academic publishing is wildly dependent on American research libraries, and probably 60 to 70% of most academic monographs end up being shoved somewhere in Wisconsin, if that's not the right way of putting it. And I just wonder how that maps into what you're doing.
Well, I mean, I think part of what we're interested in is, as I said, making sure that it's not kind of just located in those repositories, that the work is more freely available. I think funding is maybe relevant to that question, because I think you have kind of a small number of libraries that currently are funding the majority of the open access books production in one way or another. And so this is what one of the things that COPAM is working on. COPAM's work package 2 is thinking about consortial library funding and how that can be made easier, how more libraries can be brought in, how it can be made something which is more relevant to individual countries as well. Because I think a lot of the time these conversations are dominated by the US and the UK, to a certain extent Europe with organizations like Opera and things, but there's a tendency to kind of gloss over a lot of national differences. So one of the things that COPAM is doing at the moment is doing quite intensive research with different countries in Europe, and holding workshops with librarians from those countries, from places like I think the Scandinavian countries were spoken to as a group, but then we had Poland, we had a workshop with Germany, there's one with France coming up, specifically to understand what the particular landscape is like in that country and what sorts of things those libraries would need to be able to buy into a kind of consortial funding model, how they could sell that, I suppose, to their universities. So I think that's one of the things that COPAM is very alert to and trying to grapple with.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. There's a question from Margareta has posed a question in the chat. Would you like to voice that, Margareta?
Thank you. It was just I wasn't trying to be very specific. It looked specific, my question. It was I went to a conference at Goldsmiths last year. Was it last year? The time has merged, but it was all on open access, the politics, the funding, the ideals, the reality. And the worries were both the business model for many smaller presses that need to sell monographs. And so I'm really interested if you could say more, Lucy, particularly about how you sell open access. But it was also about the ref policy, if it's collapsing the expectations that seem more appropriate to journals, and the expectations for monographs, which take so many years and are very in-depth and require maybe more support and more economic support, but also more intellectual support than some open access models seem able to provide.
Yeah, I know the conference that you're talking about, and I was unfortunately on holiday then because I really wanted to go. But yeah, I mean, I think certainly in terms of the idea that the book is different from the journal, that's something, again, to bring up COPAM, that one of the reasons that we wanted to join a project like that is because open access is so often talked about in terms of journals and journal articles, and there are arguments made with things like preprints, and actually let's just have one big platform where everyone submits their manuscript, and like those sorts of things don't really work for journals, precisely because of the kind of the idea of the book as a kind of unique object, which is really important to monographs, and the way that the book is put together often is hugely important to the argument itself. It's not just, oh, here's some content and we've just stuck it in a book. So I think in terms of the funding, so I could break down ABP's costs, for example. We put a lot of our resources in terms of staff time into those editorial processes and into the production and thinking about things like those innovative presentation methods that I talked about, this kind of embedding of audio, video, and that kind of thing. And that's kind of where we put our resources as a press. So in making it open access, we aren't saying, well, let's scrap all that and just have a basic, effectively a Word document. I mean, this is one of the reasons why, in my opinion, green open access for books would be extremely difficult, because there is so much that goes into that production aspect of it. So I think with COPA in thinking about funding monographs, that's precisely one of the things that we're thinking about, is how do you develop a sustainable open access model for monographs, and not just think, oh, we'll just take what works for journals and try and slap it on. Was there something, the first part of your question that I've not covered?
So how do you sell an open access book so that you fund exactly what you're talking about and respect all that?
Sure. So I think the fact that we charge for our printed editions, it's important to a lot of people to have the printed book. I personally prefer working with printed books than working with digital books. And I think also people see buying a copy as a way to support the press as well. If people can afford to do that, it's something that we certainly value. And so I think in that sense, you kind of have the financial support from the sales for people who can afford to and want to buy the book, but then you're also providing the open access for people for whom that might not be an option for whatever reason. And it's not something that we sort of have traditional marketing in the sense that we email people when the book comes out. We're on social media. We go to conferences, not necessarily as a press because of the fees that get charged to presses to advertise, but we go as individuals, often as part of our own work, and we'll talk about the press there, we'll talk about particular books, we'll support authors with things they want to do. So in that sense, we always make it clear that the book is available to buy and that there is an open access edition as well. And as I mentioned, those two are the same. There's no difference. It's not like the printed version is better or has more content, but it's just, the printed copies aren't available for free, and the open access is.
I'm going to jump into that point. I think we probably need to kind of need to move on to the other speakers, but I'm just keen to pick up very quickly with a question to Ariana particularly. But going to this idea of the digital object, and thinking about particularly, I suppose, edge cases where you've been working with more experimental forms and micro accreditation. Also relevant to Lucey and the idea of publishing databases and how accreditation is accorded to those who contributed at relatively inconspicuous levels. But Ariana, what are the edge cases that have tested most the kind of framework of collaboration between you as software developers and publishers or publishers?
Yes, I mean, again, here there might be different models, and not the same model works everywhere the same. But definitely one of the things, in fact, that we highlight in that checklist that I mentioned before is the credits. So the importance of, so say, for example, if you have your website where you present your open publication, how the participants in the production of that work are acknowledged, meaning participant at a very inclusive level. So from the system manager that might have been involved in setting up the infrastructure, to the developer that work on the data model, to the analyst that conceptualize together with partners some of the units of analysis, to the designer who puts lots of effort into building the interfaces that after all determine how the users will interact with these objects and so on, to actually the non-human, if you like, objects that are part of this product. For example, software applications, different types of devices or dependencies that might be associated to that publication. And I think from that already you can assess, even if it's obviously not the only element, but you can assess already how rich the development behind that object might or might not be. One thing I wanted to say in reply to what I think Margareta was saying is that we also engage in quite a lot of hybrid publications where the model was indeed, so we would develop an open access environment where you would So say, for example, have an access resources available in all its search functionalities and so on online, but at the same time also a printed version that was then sold by a publisher. And that model in general, at least that's the scholarship behind it, is that they piggyback each other. So actually the online access augments some of the cells for that publication. Now, this might not be valid in every field, but at least in some of the work we did, this seemed to be the case. So I think that's also an interesting, and same is valid for libraries. I know that in libraries as well, there are a few studies that have shown how if they make accessible some of the digital collections, then the physical objects get more requests for access and so on. So I think there is an interesting connection there. Did I answer your question, Alex?
You did, thank you. Yeah, these kind of fascinating conversations. I think looking at the time, we'll probably loop back to these after the next two, but I'm going to ask Tanya now to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to both the speakers so far. It's been really interesting listening to different perspectives and organizations, and because I think Reframe that I'll be talking about is another perspective on OA and multimedia publishing. So yeah, it's good to join this conversation. Let me just see if I can share my screen. And I also was going to put a few links into the chat just on some of the Reframe projects that I'll be talking about. How do I get back to chat? Stop sharing. I was hoping to put them in at separate points in the presentation, but I think I'm just going to stress myself and everyone else out if I try and do that. So I'm just going to put them all in now. Okay. All right. Let's share the screen again. Can you see it as SlideShare view, or is it just the SlideShare view? Cool.
No,
okay.
Yeah, good.
Great. Okay, so yeah, my name is Tanya. I'm a lecturer in Media and Cultural Studies at the University of Sussex. I'm now part of the Media and Arts and Humanities School, and I was formerly part of the School of Media, Film and Music. I'm co-managing editor along with Dr. Catherine Farrimond of Reframe, which is Sussex's, and MAR, which is our school's open access multimedia research platform for research publications broadly in disciplines relating to media, arts and humanities subjects. So we've published on film studies, cultural studies, journalism, media studies, digital media studies, and yeah, disciplines that are relating to those things. Reframe was founded in 2012 by Professor Catherine Grant, and she's also the founder of Film Studies for Free. So it's had a, an open access, a strong open access ethos from its inception. Reframe is, it's school supported. We have a portal website that I've put in the chat, the text chat, which is the main website really, which is reframe.sussex.ac.uk. And this website links together over 25 different unique research projects. We support and publish a range of traditional and non-traditional publishing formats. And I would say that we have a small centralized team that manage the entire network, or the kind of platform that supports the 25 different projects. And that small central team is supports a large decentralized network of people that work and are involved in Reframe. So like, to give you an example of what that looks like on the ground, as I said, we have 2 managing editors, which is myself and Catherine, but this is a fraction of our labor time in terms of what we do as lecturers. So we don't get that much resource in terms of time to run the site or the sites. We have 1 part-time technical support officer. And then as the network kind of grows, we have a school-based editorial board. Then we have an international advisory board, and each of the projects that we support has multiple sub-editorial teams. And hopefully that will become a bit clearer what I mean once I show some examples. So yeah, what do I mean by supporting traditional and non-traditional outputs? I.e., what sort of stuff do we publish? We publish fully peer-reviewed, archived, and fully tech-supported online journals and ebook content. These are designed to support both mid-career and higher academics, but also early career researchers and doctoral students. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought because my sister manages to ring me at every time that I'm doing a public talk. Okay, yeah, so one of the things that we try and do is support doctoral and early careers researchers. That's part of our remit. So open access kind of means trying to think about who we want to support and why. Some of the examples of some of these more traditional forms of publishing that we've supported is the tablet book, which I put in the text chat. This was our first ebook. It was published in 2015. Then we had the post-cinema book, which was published in 2016. This is one of our most popular titles and has had over 120,000 views and downloads. We also have a journal called Sequence. Sequence is a traditional journal in that it is peer-reviewed, ISBN'd, and is referable. But it's also non-traditional in that we don't have a formal publishing schedule for it. So instead of it being periodic, it's sequential. This means that we publish journal articles as and when they're ready. And then we do a sequential form of publication where people can respond to those articles. I would recommend checking out the Sequence website to kind of get an idea of what I mean. The idea being that we wanted to support non-traditional ways to publish that didn't necessarily mean having to adhere to tight publishing deadlines. When we're talking about a small resource outfit, and we wanted to support publications that didn't necessarily, again, fit a normal periodic journal format, but was still fully peer-reviewed and referable, which it is. We've got some forthcoming titles in ebooks, so watch this space, and we're hoping to kind of develop largely PDF formats that kind of try and take advantage of some of the new ways of publishing and new forms of content that Lucy was talking about earlier. So like embedding videos if we can, that kind of thing. Okay. Oh yeah, the other thing that I want to mention, because I think it's probably important in terms of what we've been talking about, is that we largely only publish collaborative research projects. So we don't do monographic material. This is because we're very small. It's because other publishers are better suited to support monographic titles. And it is so that we feel we can support more people and more projects by doing this. But it would be interesting to talk about like the differences in monographic publishing versus collective publishing, for example, towards the end of the talk. Okay, so we also support non-traditional publishing formats. These tend to be ephemeral, multimedia, and again, collective outputs. So we support public-facing research blogs, such as Reframing Activism and Mediatico. These are blogs that are run by sub-editors, that they are They are run by researchers, but for public-facing audiences. So, it's similar to the conversation that we started that before the conversation did. And I'm sure as a lot of other publishers did as well. So, yes, it gives people the chance to publish their work for more public audiences than, say, a traditional journal would. And we don't require such a stringent peer review process, although we obviously have quality standards as a publisher that we expect our sites to adhere to. We support local community research projects. This is something else that I'd like to talk about, is like we often talk about reach and like, you know, the numbers need to be big. That's kind of, you know, the sort of society that we live in at the moment. But some publishing opportunities, some research opportunities, I would say, are small. So we have kind of an interest in supporting small local projects. This included, for example, a website called the Psychogeography of Lewes, Lewes being a small town near Sussex University. The website looks to support a research project that was happening there, and it includes alternative media formats such as mappings, which are kind of diary style maps that are interactive that you can access on that site. We provide online spaces for film festivals, conferences, and symposia. We have got podcasts to our name that we have supported, video archives of research events, but also supporting bite-sized impact-based videos. So Reframe Encounters is a school, reflects some of the research that's going on in the School of Media, Film and Music, and is a kind of, a bite-sized way for people to get in touch with people's research. We also have an up-and-coming project, which is an interview-based research blog. This is supposed to provide a kind of site for qualitative interview data that is going to also be published in journal formats, but is a not necessarily traditional way of making research available. Okay. So yeah, I mean, that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of what we do as a publisher. I'm just trying to think of things that I wanted to add on the top of what Lucy and our other speakers, I'm so sorry, my name escapes you, have been saying, Ariana, yes. And yeah, so to really come up with some questions that will open up the discussion. I suffer from Zoom fatigue, so I don't like to talk for too long in these spaces. Some of the questions I thought we might want to kind of discuss are issues around which formats to use. So PDF, website, ebook, or status update. Which are the preferred formats for both academics and publishers and audiences? This comes from a kind of personal flag waving thing that I do about the value of PDFs. So I know that PDFs are sort of frowned upon for various reasons and for really good reasons. But as someone that used to work in print publishing that has then moved on to ebook and e-publishing, the merits of PDFs for their accessibility still for me outweigh some of the other ways in which we have different ebook formats. So, you know, I'm interested in hearing what other people think about what we should be publishing in an environment where formats change all the time. And for me, PDF is still that kind of good, steadfast format that people can really easily access. Go big or go home. How can we streamline editorial processes, and especially for publishers such as myself and Reframe, where we're very small and we have very few resources? How can we think about open access publishing in contemporary competitive university environments? And I think this touches on some of the amazing kind of ways to rethink open access publishing and also funding that the other two speakers talked about. Do we work with or against REF and TEF frameworks? How can we recognize the value of practice-based research in these frameworks, for example? And then I was also thinking about how handy it is to be able to share the links to Reframe projects in the chat for Zoom, because usually I'm trying to talk about all these projects and they're all really different. And it's actually been really great to just be like, here, have a look at them yourself. And that made me think about, well, what does publishing in a post-pandemic world look like? You know, now that we're on Zoom, is there anything else that we should be thinking about in terms of publishing that might be affected, that might be connected to the kind of fallout of the pandemic? And as academic content producers, what do we and our audiences need from open access publishing right now? And are our needs the same as our audiences? I'll leave it there. Thank you. Find us on Facebook or Twitter or via our website, or you email me if you have any other questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Tanya. It's great to hear about so much dynamic innovation happening on the doorstep of the SHL, which I wasn't fully aware of. And yes, some fantastic questions that we can return to after we hear from Tim Hitchcock.
Okay, hi. Thanks very much, and I will be short and I will be brief. If those actually work, let's see. And that looks like that's pretty much come up on your screen, if I'm not wrong. And can I just say thanks, Suzanne, for inviting me, and late in the day, and I hope that I don't cause everybody too much Zoom fatigue along the way. And I was asked to speak because Bob Shoemaker and Sharon Howard and I recently published a open access monograph. It was very much, it wasn't in the context of a major press. We basically did it at home and DIY, but it is also a output that came at the end of 20 years of hard work. And I would give you the URL for that book, just so you can go and have a look at it and find it. But if I did so, I would be breaking the law, as lawyers from Cambridge University Press would come along and sue me for breach of contract. Because following years of negotiation, CUP allowed us to republish the book as a second edition under whatever Creative Commons license we wanted, including a CC by NC 4.0. And the only exception they made was that we ourselves could not promote the URL or publication in any way. And I think that reflects, in some respects, some of the conundrums around open access as a space. It is absolutely at the core of an argument between traditional publishers on the one hand and all the facilities and affordances of the online. But despite that absurdity, and it is fundamentally absurd, I'm still really proud to have gotten to the point where anyone but me can read and reuse this text, especially as getting to this point has been the work of the last, well, 2 decades anyway, certainly since 1998. And what I hope this book does is exemplify the affordances of open access to rethink scholarship. It is about producing an electronic text that isn't simply a reproduction of a book, but is a form of open linked scholarship, if you like. So what I want to do this afternoon, very briefly, is take you through the thinking that finally created something that looks to me like an open access monograph, like a new form of monograph. And to then say a little bit about the absurdities of academic publishing at the minute. The book itself is some 140,000 words long. It is built on an online archive that we have put together over the last 20, 30 years of about 250,000 pages of primary sources. And it argues that the evolution of London and of social welfare and the criminal justice system is determined by the behavior of criminals and paupers, more than the thinking of elites and governors. It is in many ways a very old-fashioned piece of academic writing in the British Marxist tradition. But because it was, let's see if I can get this, let me make sure why are you not going to the next page? Fuck. Okay. But because it was created with open access at the front of our minds, and this is open access as it existed 15 odd years ago, it also does a bunch of things that Bob Shoemaker and I think are important. It's easy to navigate in that way that ebooks are, and each paragraph is numbered to avoid issues around pagination. And each graph is connected to the underlying spreadsheets and the underlying data sources upon which it's based. You can simply click through to, first of all, the graph, and then to the primary source upon which that data set was built. And each image is connected to the repository where it's held. So this is a direct link to the British Museum's website. And every name in the text is connected. You can see somebody like, let's see, Mary Thornton there is connected to a comprehensive portal to all the documents associated with that person. And of course, every quote in the text, and there are thousands of them, is linked in turn to the original primary source that it was found in, with both an image of the original and the transcript. And each footnote appears in the text as a pop-up as you read it. And of course, takes you to the endnotes, which in turn links you, where appropriate, to something like Google Books. So there are thousands of endnotes, obviously, in a book of this length. But what was remarkable was the percentage of references that we wanted to make to 18th and 19th century texts and 20th century texts that were available in full text in Google Books. Or for 18th century material, you could link directly from the footnotes or indeed from the text into the English short title catalog, which in turn gives you access to online data sets like GIST historic texts. And of course, to JSTOR and other forms of journal publication. We basically use DOIs as the hook upon which to add all of our links outwards into that wider open world of data. And in the end, what you end up with is a text that is made up of layers and layers of links. There are, as well as JSTOR and Google Books and all the rest of it, there are also 4 or 5 other repositories, including things like the UK Parliamentary Archives. You then, of course, get an interactive, you then get an interactive bibliography. You get an index. We reproduce the hard copy index, but then paired it with a keyword search facility, so that what you can have is really 2 models of how you might use search and representation to think about how that works. All of which is where we ended up after really a generation of building stuff. There are around 4,000 external URLs involved, and about the same number of internal links. We excluded all links to paywalled material apart from JSTOR, and excluded items in Google Books that did not give at least some access to the underlying text. And the remarkable thing from our perspective was that we could create a fully evidenced, substantial monograph. It felt pretty substantial when you throw it at somebody as a hard copy, in an open access format that included live links for almost everything we wanted to cite. A lot of those citations and links were obviously the things that Bob Shoemaker and I had ourselves built. But the thing that really struck us was the extent to which there was so much out there, so many materials, that we were not, we did not feel frustrated by our ability to build an academic argument on the back of it. And for me, the irony is that while the technology to do this sort of thing has been around for 30 years, I mean, I first started teaching the use of hyperlinks to undergraduates in 1989, 4 years before the World Wide Web came along. And though the aspirations to tie technology to scholarship and research has been around a lot longer, right through the 70s, this old-fashioned bit of scholarship is actually pretty unusual. It actually takes something slightly further than most other publications of its sorts. And one of the burdens I carry for a lifetime of sin is being sent endless dull tomes on the digital humanities. And most of that stuff is still being published as hard copy books, as bricks. And I have more than enough of these bricks to build a wall. And yet, to get even to the ridiculously old school point where London Live sits, it is imagined a generation ago, was a battle against the forces of the world of academic publishing. Now, today we've heard some fantastic examples of how publishing is changing and the ways in which open access can be made to work within it. And I'm afraid mine is a simple voice of depression and doom in an otherwise uplifting story. But in some ways, we thought we'd cracked it with the posting of primary sources online, of archives of the sources of social history, in a series of free archives over the last 20 years, through the Old Bailey Online, London Live, Locating London's Past, Connected Histories, and the Digital Panopticon. Bob Shoemaker and I thought we'd actually done a lot of the work of liberating social history from the confines of publishing. We thought that by making open access and freely available what is now almost 40 billion words of historical data, that someone would take note and that scholarship would itself change. And we even got CUP to promise to originally produce London Lives as a fully interactive ebook. And that was in 2008. Only to find by 2015, after we'd actually written the thing, that all bets were off and they would produce nothing more technically challenging than a PDF. And excuse me for denigrating PDFs. I realize that that's not the flavor of the room, but it's hard. Anyway, arguably, what happened to us was that all the aspirations and invention of the new world of digital scholarship that seemed so close to one's grasp in the 1990s finally came to some kind of fruition in 2020. But even then, we were confronted by the forces of the commercial presses, the forces of a rentier culture that seeks profit by owning IP, the forces of reaction, of conservatism, and of simple greed. And where I've ended up after that process is a belief that we really do need to rebuild, that we need to rebuild the presses, we need to rethink publishing, and we need to rethink what the book looks like. Now, I'm really pleased to have gotten as far as we did. And I should say that the people at CUP were very nice about it, really. But I am also appalled that something we could easily imagine 30 years ago is only now finding a form. And it's as if we have gone backwards. And just by way of conclusion, I just want to say, fuck it. I don't care if CUP comes from my pension. The URL for the book is there, and I hope you get a chance to read it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tim. And I just point out that this is all being recorded and will be.
Yes, I know. It'll be. That's. I figured that.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, just immediately, can anyone cheer Tim up? Lucy, Ariana, Tanya.
I wanted to say, I thank you. It's really interesting and nice and layered and under many respects. But just one provocative question. So you're obviously putting all the burden on the academic publishing, but what about the mechanism of recognition in scholarship as well? Because obviously you are an established historian that did a marvelous career, and you can do this. But what about, say, a young researcher, early career researcher, who is really engaged in publishing something that is very innovative and yet can't get any post in any traditional departments?
I absolutely agree with you, and I acknowledge that my position of privilege within that system, and we absolutely need to rethink acknowledgement, how we cite, how we recruit, how we do all of that stuff. It's not one or the other. I'm blaming the presses because they're not here. In fact, senior research managers, and if you wanted to get really anxious about it, I mean, even the models of open access publishing that rely on print on demand and grant funding, they're all built within a hierarchy that privileges the global north. They privilege a certain variety of voices, and they're structured absolutely in a hierarchical system of power and exclusion. We've known that all along. The problem is that we don't have a solution to it.
Anybody else? Lucy, Tanya?
I think I agree with a lot of that. And so, like, the sort of work that we are doing is to try and provide a kind of alternative to that sort of monolithic structure that you've identified. The difficulty is precisely that point, that researchers look at OBP and think, how will that look on my CV compared to if I try and publish with IUP or whoever it might be. I think, though, there are the fact that people do choose to publish with us anyway, and the fact that we have champions, you know, more senior and more junior, who are willing to go out there and tell their colleagues to publish with us or with similar presses. You know, I think that gives me some hope that there is a will somewhere to change it. I think it's like turning a massive tanker around, and it's not going to happen anytime soon. But I think there is to some extent, the policy demands are something that I find hopeful. I mean, the devil's always in the detail with the policy, but the fact that there is pressure coming from organisations like UKRI saying this is how we are going to publish means that you aren't relying on a kind of inert publishing structure. The publishing structure is being forced to respond to these demands that are being placed on it.
On the other hand, if you look at something like Plan S and the kind of gold open access structures that are being embedded within that, essentially being led by STEM, what you end up with is something where you shift the power a little bit, but it sure as hell doesn't go outside of a privileged hierarchical and Western system. Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think that's why when we're thinking about how we fund ourselves, it was so important for us not to charge the book processing charge, because you don't eradicate any barriers by introducing that. You just move them away from the reader and onto the author side. And I think one of the reasons why COPIM is invested in, you know, finding ways for presses to operate without needing that. I think actually one of the things that frustrates me about some of the larger presses, not necessarily the commercial presses because they have commercial imperative, but some of the university presses, it's the fact that they are still relying on these massive charges when they, you know, of any press you would imagine would have the resources to try to start developing alternative means of funding and have the mission where this is what they should be doing. And yet, to my mind, it's the smaller presses, it's presses like us that are doing that work, and these bigger presses aren't really at the moment on the field, basically.
Can I ask, and this was a question that kind of came up in some questions that were being gathered before this, and it's possibly for people from the Sussex Library or elsewhere here, what are the pressure points which can help sort of redress the issues of prestige and kind of imbalance of prestige of presses and recognition, and how that is kind of, you know, performed through the academic community? Does anybody have any?
I'll comment on that. I'm not part of the library, but I think, you know, yeah, listening to Tim really, really interesting, and you know, in some ways it makes me come back to like this comment that I seem to say at literally every single event I speak at, which is like, but capitalism though, you know, like, so where do we draw the line between what we're talking about as structural problems that are specific to academia and open access publishing, and where does it become book capitalism though, which is a really quite a difficult problem for a bunch of panicked academics to try and solve by themselves. And I think being honest about our positionality is really important. Like, as Tim and Ariana were kind of mentioning, it's easier, I would argue, although someone might want to argue back, that for mid plus career academics to find spaces to challenge the system as opposed to early career researchers. And I think, you know, if I wanted to play devil's advocate, do we want to get rid of prestige altogether? Is that not what we want as knowledge producers? We live in a post-truth world. Do we not want to ask, you know, where does truth come from, and where does good knowledge come from? Is that even, you know, do you know what I'm trying to get at here? So we've got some really difficult problems here. I think to kind of, the hope for me, if I was going to say something to cheer Tim up, would be reframe. I like the way it operates as an extremely small ad hoc publisher, that we're not too bogged down with producing reproducing established schedules and established formats, but we still take them quite seriously because I think we have to.
On the subject of prestige, can I Rachel, would you like to come in? You've put a comment in the chat, which seems salient. Rachel Thompson.
Oh, thank you. I don't know if I've got, yeah, I just quite like to throw things into the chat so randomly. I guess there were two things I was thinking. One is like, what is the role of the university in all of this? And I suppose it also links, because I tend to think of the role of the university in some level is around the sustainability side, that as institutions go, well, this is a big question mark, isn't it? I used to think as institutions go, the university was probably as about as sustainable as you get. But I think we're all just facing up to the fact that that might not be the case in the way that perhaps we thought about. And, you know, the big issue around sort of digital as well as open access seems to be sustainability. How do we ensure, whether it's formats or simply doing the work to keep it, you know, to keep it up to date and linked into a changing environment? You know, who's going to do that work over time? And then the other thing was around prestige. I just wonder whether, I mean, obviously, that's what academics are specialists in, isn't it? Producing and then harvesting prestige. So in some ways, perhaps there is the work of curating is one of the areas where some of the energy needs to go into, sort of quite closely curating series, and rather than seeing lots of one-off kind of things, but being very strategic and close to disciplines and close to the sort of political work that happens in disciplines about what counts, what's important. And that might drag in a slightly different direction than access, like who's able to get hold of it and breaking down the barriers of the university. So they're not really, they're just kind of, I suppose the sustainability and what's the university for is a question.
I think this relates to something that actually Margrethe has also put in the chat about work that Reframe has done supporting debates on expertise, parenthesis, collectivized, democratized. And I'm wondering if, just to actually return to one of Tanya's questions and the idea of kind of, you know, post-pandemic academic publishing and what being in a kind of the form we're in today, where debate is being recorded and essentially kind of published in some, potentially published in some way. And the questions of kind of live publication, collaborative publication, and the kind of work that Sequence does, which could be more kind of arborescent than sequential potentially, and entail argumentation and contestation within that. I mean, are there completely new models for kind of publication as something that is kind of much more closely integrated to the life of scholarship as knowledge as it is produced? So the publication becomes an ongoing form of capture in a sense, and the academic collective has a different kind of role in relationship to them.
I think that's a very difficult question, and I think relates to also the question on sustainability, in that what is it that we are sustaining here? So I think it depends how you look at a product of scholarship. So if, as you say, what you want to sustain, for example, are the data sets behind, or say the evidence, to call it in a less digital lexicon, you have certain model of doing that, which might, as also Tim was saying, in some cases might rely on actually very old-fashioned technological solutions, but doesn't matter. Or you might have situations where to sustain a resource, you need indeed to sustain the whole process. So say, for example, I don't know, a collaborative edition that it never ends because, I don't know, maybe the author is still alive and maybe those manuscripts are still tinkered with, and maybe that annotation process is part of. So obviously that requires a totally different model where you have to think of sustaining that and some of the functionalities that maybe in something that it's more, how can I say, definite in its format, you wouldn't have to. So I don't think there is a solution for all, but I think the recognition that All these things, no matter how innovative they are, or even if they rely on very old-fashioned technology, they still require indeed that curation and maintenance and that expertise. Whatever this expertise sit, I think it's very important. And I wanted to add, in relation also to what Rachel is saying, one more element of the trilogy. So we mentioned publishers, we mentioned obviously scholars and academics and students as well. But we didn't mention libraries, archives, museums that much. And I think that the new call of the HRC, the new program towards a national collection, at least my hope is that it's trying to relate all these elements and to look at sustainability beyond also universities, to look at models of connecting different roles in this environment that it's quite complex, but potentially not necessarily technologically complex, but complex at a different level, at the level of the conventions we use, the schemas we use, the policy, the recognition, and how we account for impact or prestige and so on.
Tim.
Could I just come in on sustainability? Because it seems to me that one of the big issues is that we all have inherited an assumption about sustainability that is unrealistic. I mean, we really, the number of 17th century books that are actually that we know existed that no longer can be found is massive. There's no reason that our scholarship needs necessarily to continue to exist 20 years after the last person interested in reading it open the book or open the website. So if what one thinks is that scholarship is an ongoing slow dialogue, it's okay if lots of stuff falls off the end.
Absolutely, I totally agree with that. So there are things that are ephemeral, or more things that are more ephemeral than others. So that's what I mean. It depends what it is that we want to sustain.
Margareta, would you like to comment on that?
Well, we're all thinking the same thing. This is a question of time and different speeds and temporalities, and I'm just so much wanting slow time, and let's slow everything. So to me, Tim, you in 1989 thinking this, well, that's not long ago, for goodness sake. To me, no, absolutely, we should have digital books be able to be unread for a decade and still, but the problem is it's the economy and the politics that are rushing everything. So I don't know. I'm kind of, I think Rachel's right that we maybe have to admit some need to work within the system enough to have a sustained non-profit model for universities, to work within the system, to have some publishers working in a, I don't know. I think there's different levels and types of capitalism. And obviously, this because my project is, at the moment, is looking at feminist business and the many small publishers that learned business skills in order to publish radical things. And I think it's perfectly fine to have a for-profit, if so long as it's done in the right way and at the right level. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's all a bit of both and. But yeah, we have so many challenges. And I just on the prestige, and I think, Tanya, that was also really useful word of going, let's admit that's part of the capital is around cultural capital, intellectual capital, prestige capital. And this is the strange, valueless, but completely valuable thing that Taylor and Francis and people like that can, are owning at the moment. And it's a strange thing, but it is real. You can't pretend it isn't. So I haven't solved it. I'm just agreeing, really.
One thing that might be worth throwing into the conversation at this point is a term that we're working with in COPIM. This idea, it's called scaling small. And the idea behind it, it sort of informs the infrastructure that we're building, that it should work to support presses at multiple scales. So the idea shouldn't just be, well, you have the mega publishers that can do it, and that, that you can actually support work, some of which might only be short term. So Scholar-led used to be a consortium of 6 presses. There used to be a press called Mayfly Press, who was part of Scholar-led. And the whole idea behind Mayfly was they would be there perhaps for a very short time, make a small number of books, and then they would go. And it seems that that's what happened. But they produce those books, and those books are available. And the idea with COPIM is that it will support presses that are working potentially at that level, as well as sort of more mid-sized, smaller presses like OBP. And there's another press in the consortium, Mattering, that publishes 2 to 3 books a year. And the idea is that once you bring all those together, the scholar-led catalogue on OAPEN has over 500 books in it now, and it's I think the second largest catalogue on the site. So once you enable those activities on multiple levels and in multiple ways, you can actually bring something together which is quite large and quite substantial.
From the ephemeral, just looking at Ty's comment, and thinking about versionings in response to Tim's presentation. Ty, do you want to comment on that? Or extend the question? Don't worry if not. Okay.
Can I just chip in that? I've got a feeling we may all get thrown out in a few minutes' time. I'd like to think that won't be the case, but there's a possibility we might. So we might want to just sort of wrap up and say do our thank yous just in case that does happen.
Well, in which case, thank you to everyone. I mean, I and some people may want to leave. Some people may want to stay for a little longer and talk on. Perhaps it seems hard to kind of tie things up in these open-ended online conversations. But thank you very much to Suzanne for organising this, and to all the speakers, those who stepped in at the last minute and those who came in adverse circumstances, particularly. But to all of you, it's been a very interesting conversation, I think, and it's a generative one which we need to find a way to continue in Sussex and in the Humanities Lab, I think, and hopefully we will return to. So please feel free to log off at any point now. I've got one question that I want to ask, which it came out of actually questions that were being gathered before this, which relates to user interfaces for publication, and both kind of modularity and reproducibility, or kind of reuse of those, and the kind of investments that have been made by the Mellon Foundation in the States, and possibly the consortium that you're working with, Lucy, here, and around open sourcing of those, which is something that Ariana might know about, but also about more, I suppose, more experimental interfaces to kind of live knowledge production. I think Scalar is doing some work on that kind, but also perhaps to Tim, what his desiderata, his ultimate desiderata for that would be from the perspective of 2020 rather than of 1989, and possibly Tanya, for something like sequence, is there a way to make to create interfaces for that that's more engaging for reachable or guides them? Can I ask that? There's this very last minute.
I mean, just to throw in that, I mean, one of the things that we worried at for a long, long time was architecture, and moving towards, an API-based architecture that separated off notions of evidence from front-end commentary. And I think this is the sort of thing that Alan Liu has been worrying at. If you look at the rise of both DOIs, but PIDs as well, what we're gradually moving towards is a recognition that the infrastructure of the relationship between, like, commentary and data is in some ways, has to be solved first.
Yeah, I was going to say that also, for example, as part of that TANC program that I mentioned, the Towards a National Collection program that I mentioned before, the kind of architectures indeed they would like to experiment more are indeed the ones that provide a more flexible approach. So rather than at the end of this big project producing a monolithic resource, why not instead focus indeed on the data collections themselves and the APIs in and out, so that you can both ingesting data in different formats and from different provenances, if you like, whatever those are, and equally at the same time spit out data that could feed into, for example, data visualizations, processes of different kinds, or external vendors, applications, and so on. And what in the design framework, I think, are called generous interfaces. And one of the interesting conversations we had, even if obviously it's still preliminary at this stage, with the National Archives, for example, is the work they've done within their Project Alpha, where they do look indeed at basically exploiting their data sets in different ways for different audiences, for for an audience that is also not necessarily so knowledgeable about the structure of the data and knowing what they're looking for, but on the other hand wants to explore and have an overview of the material, if you like, maybe more in a more serendipitous way, even if I don't necessarily like that concept that much, because even serendipity has its own conventions and its own structures. But it's definitely a shift in from the silos resources that provide a kind of established interface to something that is much more fluid, still relies a lot on user research and ways of enabling certain experiences with the data, but it's more flexible in its structure and therefore also open potentially to multiple perspectives.
And allows kind of migration up between levels of expertise, so the same data can be employed for pedagogical purposes or for teaching.
Yeah, and with the idea, and I think within the research context, the focus is still how can we make sure that whatever, whatever path we choose, we still can track that path. So if I produce a graph, so for example, the example teams were showing were quite interesting. So if I produce a graph, can I track back how that graph was produced, what data set is behind it, what tools I've used to do it, what limitations are, how can I critique it, and so on. And I think this is also very relevant for teaching in digital humanities as well, because it's a way to unpack the resources that we create.
I was going to say, the really interesting thing about the election last week was that all the data visualizations ended up being rather unconvincing. And what became really convincing was when people started exposing the underlying, essentially structured data that people could start unpicking and playing with. And I think there's a message there for the digital humanities that, you know, all the flashbang wizardry that you might want in terms of visualization actually may not do the work.
Yeah, the COVID is another example, I think.
I think about it as a non-digital humanities researcher, you know, what does your audience want, as would be something that you know, who is your audience? And I think you know, as Alex, you were saying, the idea that you can you know, use the same data set for different levels of expertise, and also maybe think about the fact that not all audiences want to be able to dig into the data, and that not all audiences should be expected to dig into the data as well. I think that's quite, because one thing I wanted to do is do like shout out to like Labour right here. Like, I think it was Lucy saying, you know, that publishing is laborious. Like, good publishing should be laborious as well sometimes. You know, as someone that I've worked in print publishing before I became drawn back into academia, and you know, stuff takes ages, and it should, because we want to take pride in the work that we do. So I think there's a question there about who does the labor of delving into the data and why, and that there's trust involved in that as well. I'm not offering any solutions again. I'm just kind of thinking out loud in terms of what the answers are and what we want from our interfaces. Because, for example, with Reframe, what I think, we work with a lot of people that are not data scientists and don't even know how to use WordPress, right? You know, like, we're talking interfaces that are what might seem very simplistic to some, but actually, you know, very difficult for others. And so to try and come out with an output for me that is readable for a lot of different audiences, or for a popular audience, is quite important. Less so for me personally than being able to access the data, but I think that's probably my own expertise that makes me think like that, because I'm not a data scientist. But
this feels like a very kind of enjoyable post-seminar kind of drink and wine down. But we should probably, I mean, I feel like I need something actually to kind of moisten my throat. So maybe we should end there. But thank you very, unless there are any pressing questions for anyone who hasn't spoken from, but I imagine they would appear in the chat. So thank you, it's been very enjoyable, and I hope we'll, there may be, just by coincidence, possibly the next SHL seminar will be about generous interfaces. Maybe, so we'll let you know if it is, Aaron.
Yes, please. Thanks very much to all of you for organizing it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
Good to
you.
see you.
Thank
Also-
you. It's been really interesting. Thank you.
Bye bye.